I'm Stephen Lisney. I'm Chair of Trustees of Brace, and we are a dementia research charity. For today's webinar, we're being joined by Dr. Byron Creese from the University of Exeter, and I'm going to ask him to introduce himself and tell us about his background a little bit later on. Also helping this morning are Amanda Cole, Emma Bone and Mark Porch from the Brace staff team who've done the work to be able to set up our meeting this morning. Now, before I hand over the screen rights to Byron, I'd like to say something about Brace. We're a Bristol-based dementia research charity, and we've been working for just over 30 years. Our aims are fourfold. We want to improve the understanding of the causes of this group of diseases, because we're not, when we say dementia, we're using the word in an umbrella term, as it were, and we know that there are subtypes of dementia, of which Alzheimer's disease is the most common. So we're not just focusing on just one form of dementia, but all forms of dementia. So that's our first aim, to understand the causes of these diseases. Secondly, we would like to improve diagnosis. We know that the changes that are contributing to the disease begin 10, possibly even 15 years before there are clinical outward signs of what is going on inside the brain. So we need tools that clinicians can use, simple tools that enable a diagnosis to be made earlier. And we're getting better. We've made a lot of advances, but there's still more to be done. And of course, we would like to find treatments. If we could find a treatment to prevent the disease altogether, of course, that would be the gold standard. But if we could halt the disease or even modify the symptoms, then that would offer a better situation than we have now. And our fourth aim is to share information and to promote that. So whether it's between researchers or whether it's between researchers and public audiences, that is part of our remit too. We support research at universities across the southwest of England and in South Wales. So that includes Exeter, where Byron is based. And we hold information events. At the moment, of course, we can't do that in a physical sense, and so we're doing it virtually as through this webinar. Over the last 30 years, 35 years, there have been growing research efforts to try and find answers to the problem of dementia. It's involved charities like ourselves, Brace, the Alzheimer's Society, Alzheimer's Research UK, the Wellcome Trust. It's involved government agencies through their research councils and also through the National Institute for Health Research. And of course, dementia is not just a UK issue, it's an international one. So there are enormous efforts being made internationally. And yet, despite all this work, we still have no effective treatments. We have improved our knowledge of these disease processes. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, we have better tools for diagnosis. But dementia remains a major health issue, both in the UK and internationally. And while I don't want to scare people with numbers, we have to remember that last year, dementia was the main cause of death in the UK, ahead of cancer, heart disease, stroke. And for those of you who know the Southwest, that's a major county town the size of Taunton every year. So it's a significant problem. Our lack of answers is why research must continue. Dementia, I'm sorry to have to say, will still be with us after we have found the way to live with COVID-19. And we will find a way to live with COVID-19. We know what causes it. We have a virus. We can study the virus, as you will have heard biomedical scientists and doctors are doing now. They're finding out about its structure, its nature, where its weaknesses might be, and so forth. But that won't be the case with dementia. We don't have a virus that causes dementia. In fact, we don't know what is the triggering factor. And as I say, that is why the research effort must continue, and why we must continue to support researchers like Byron. Every piece of the jigsaw that we can discover will contribute, it will be valuable, it will be useful. And at some point, an individual researcher or a group of researchers is going to find that breakthrough piece to the jigsaw that is going to enable the picture to become clear. So the work of BRACE remains important, and I hope that you will remember us and consider us for a donation. All charities, as you'll be well aware, are feeling the financial impact of COVID quite severely. But we have to look ahead, and issues like dementia aren't going away. We need to continue the research effort. Now, before I switch to Byron, just a few housekeeping things. We're keeping everybody muted. That's so that any noises that might happen where you are at home or in the office or wherever, they won't trigger you to suddenly become the focus of attention on screen during the webinar. We're leaving it up to you whether you leave your video on and or off. That is your choice. If you wish to leave your video on, that's fine. If you wish to switch it off, that's equally fine. If you're watching carefully on your screen, you'll see that the little red recording light is flashing. That's so that we can record Byron's contribution today, and we will be respecting your personal privacy through an editing process, so that the only thing that we're recording for is Byron's contribution. The last thing that in the housekeeping is about questions. I'm sure that you will have questions that you want to ask of Byron. Those thoughts might come to you during the talk. You may have them already, in which case we would encourage you to use the chat button that you can find at the bottom of your screen. Some of you have already used the chat to say hello and welcome to everybody, but please go to the chat button and record your question, and then we'll come to them at the end. So without any further delay, I think this is now the right moment for my helpers to switch away from me and to Byron, and then Byron will introduce himself and then present his talk.
Okay, well, good morning everyone, and thank you, Stephen. I'm just going to try to share my screen now. So, this one. Okay, can everyone see Stephen, is or someone from BRACE, is my PowerPoint visible and clear?
Yep, you're there, Byron.
Okay.
Yep.
Great. Well, thank you to BRACE for organising this event. It's a really important charity for funding in the Southwest and supports some really great work across universities in the Southwest. And thank you for the invitation to speak. I know we've got some people from abroad, I think maybe the States and even Australia, so good evening and maybe good very early morning to you if you've joined. I think that's one of the nice things about the webinar format is accessibility, so welcome if you've if this is the first time you've attended a talk online. I hope it's engaging for you. There are, as Stephen pointed out, some quite sobering statistics about dementia around. I'm trying hopefully to convey something positive in this talk. I'm going to start with describing what dementia is, which is probably a slightly less positive part, but it's important to go through because we need to know why it's important. Then I'll talk about why we want to think about dementia prevention. And I'll talk then about some of the latest research on ways we can reduce our individual risk. And then there'll be a couple of points just about ways that people can take part in research, because that's hugely important that we continue that. So what is dementia? I mean, Stephen outlined this a little bit already. Dementia terms is an umbrella term, and it refers to a clinical condition which is characterized largely by progressive memory loss. So memory loss that gets worse over time. And dementia, that clinical condition, can be caused by a variety of different diseases. The most common, it would be Alzheimer's disease, and perhaps the best known, but also dementia due to Lewy body disease and vascular disease are also very common as well. The diseases that cause dementia visibly shrink the brain. So we can think of dementia as a physical disease. On the left-hand side there you have a healthy brain, and on the right-hand side you have the brain of somebody with advanced Alzheimer's disease. So you don't need a microscope to see what's the damage that's being done in the brain. Age is the biggest risk factor for dementia, but dementia is not an inevitable part of aging. I will just highlight this. It's a really great campaign from Alzheimer's Research UK, which is another dementia charity in the UK. It's called Share the Orange, and they made some really short videos, well worth 2 minutes of your time. Samuel L. Jackson, Bryan Cranston, and Christopher Eccleston, just about that really nicely describe the impact of dementia and what dementia is. And it's called Share the Orange because roughly the weight of an orange is the volume of brain that's lost during the course of dementia. So can we treat dementia? Well, there are no the diseases that cause dementia, sorry. So there are no available treatments for diseases that cause dementia. The only drugs that we have, they treat the symptoms. So they treat memory loss. And so you can think of this a bit like taking a painkiller. If you fall off your bike and bruise your leg, the painkiller, paracetamol, is going to treat your pain, but it's not actually going to do anything about the soft tissue injury, the bruise on your leg. With respect to Alzheimer's disease and other dementias, ideally a disease-modifying treatment we would be able to initiate once we see some memory loss or evidence of disease, and that would stop the disease and therefore stop the memory decline. That's what current research is aiming for and looking for. What we can do at the moment is something more like this blue line, and this is just a cartoon I drew. It's just representative, but basically, one memory starts to decline, and we can treat the symptoms of the memory loss with a couple of different classes of drugs, and that just stabilizes the memory loss for about a year or so. But then the drugs do stop working because we're not treating the disease, and so ultimately the progression carries on. So prevention then is really important, because an effective drug treatment, although it's intensively researched, is still some years away. Even if we had an effective treatment, I think it's fair to say we still want to do things to prevent ourselves getting to the stage when we're needing to take drugs, which may need to be taken long term, or who knows. So prevention is important, and as a bonus, many of the ways that we can, as I'll show, many of the ways that we can reduce our risk of dementia are known to boost quality of life, well-being, and lower risk for a whole host of other diseases as well. So really, it's about a lot of these lifestyle factors that I'll talk about. It's about starting to think about dementia as well as thinking about all the other more well-known benefits. Before I get on to that, I'm just going to have mention a word about genetics. Now, genetics, studying genes tells us a lot of important information about the biology of the disease. There are research groups around the world working on using genetic information to identify people who are more at risk of getting Alzheimer's disease. However, we can't do anything about our genes, and seems to be the case that actually modifiable changes, things that we can do, probably have a greater impact on our risk than our genetics do. So I'm not going to focus any more about genetics in this presentation, but I thought I'd mention it because it's something people often think, you know, mum or dad has or had dementia, and you know, I'm destined to get it and there's nothing I can do. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today has come from this really important report. You can Google dementia Lancet Commission and it'll come up. It's pretty heavy reading, but there's an executive summary at the start, which if you want, I would recommend. But I am going to try and distill that into kind of clear and understandable slides over the next few minutes. So this report, this commission was brought together a couple of years ago, and they identified 9 potentially modifiable risk factors for dementia. And this year they added 3 more to that list. So this is the list, and they're important at various different stages of life. So early life education, there's not much we can do about that now, so I'm not going to talk any more about that. Hearing loss, traumatic brain injury, hypertension, excessive alcohol consumption, and obesity are things that we can do in midlife. So we'd be talking 45 to 65 years old. And as we get into later life, 65 plus, smoking, depression, social isolation, physical inactivity, so exercise, air pollution, and diabetes. I'm going to focus, I mean, you may notice actually that a few of these things are going to be quite closely related. There's obviously links between physical activity and obesity and cardiovascular health. Mental health and social isolation will be linked. So I won't go through all of these, but I've tried to pick out the 3 that I think capture most of these 12. I hope you can see the percentages, but basically across this curve here, which represents the lifespan, these percentages refer to the number of cases globally that we would see reduced if we were to fully address these risk factors. So for example, hearing loss would be an 8% reduction in prevalence of dementia globally. So collectively, the headline is that up to kind of 40% of dementia cases might be preventable. Before I go on to the next slide, you can put it in the chat or keep it for the end, but I wonder if anyone is surprised to see any of these 12 in this list, or perhaps you thought there would be risk factors in this list and they're not represented. And maybe at the end we can discuss why that might be. So there's the headline, and along with that, the kind of positive message is it's never too early or too late to take action to reduce your risk of dementia. So this is where hopefully we can demonstrate kind of a somewhat rare positive good news story in the dementia news. So a little bit more about these modifiable risk factors. So some have to come from government policy, or that government policy will affect everything. Politics affects, you know, every part of our daily lives, but in particular, early life education, air pollution, and traumatic brain injury risk reduction are things I think that need a bit of policy input. You'll need health and safety regulation to protect you at work. It's not that easy to move house if you live in a polluted area, so you need policies to reduce that. And obviously early life education, particularly in lower middle income countries, it needs to come really from the government. So there's things then that we can do individually, and this will be most of the focus of this talk for the rest of this talk. Exercise, cutting out smoking, even in later life, and keeping excessive, or don't consume excessive amounts of alcohol. I won't talk any more about those 2 purely because of time, and I think it's probably not surprising that they're on this list. The other thing is broadly keeping in check a certain list of medical conditions, diabetes, your blood pressure, keep that in a normal range and not high. keep your weight in check, and hearing as well. And I like to also point out that there are possibly things we can do for others as well. So social contacts, it necessarily involves other people, but also hearing aid use. I don't know about everybody else, but I've certainly had relatives that need a hearing aid and they either don't use it, or they forget to use it, or they need a hearing test and they won't go and get one. And I appreciate there's a whole load of complex reasons for that often, but one of the things that my mum and I did with my granddad was just badger him to wear his hearing aid, basically. But that's our family. So, but there are things we can do for other people, which I think is a nice thing to point out. Okay, so I'm going to get onto some specifics now. So, exercise. Perhaps no surprises that this is in the list. It's beneficial for a whole host of things. I think I've heard colleagues and various other people say if you could bottle up exercise and sell it, you'd have companies making all sorts of money off it. But it's something we've got to do ourselves. It reduces risk of diabetes. It keeps blood pressure and cardiovascular health in check, and it helps keep your weight down. And those three things are also risk factors for dementia. So if we can exercise, there's kind of indirect risk reduction by reducing risk for these other medical conditions. Exercise is not the only story when it comes to blood pressure and diabetes. So do keep an eye on those as well, particularly as you approach kind of mid and later life. So we think, I've just said this, there's probably indirect effects, but we think actually there might be direct effects of exercise on keeping your brain healthy as well. We're still not sure about the particular type of exercise that needs to be done. However, the evidence looks like, it should be regular and it should be sustained, and probably weekly, at least breaking into a sweat. So that's what's known as moderate to vigorous exercise. And you can find on the NHS website exercise guidelines just for general use, and they would, I'm sure, fit into this, I believe. If possible, start in midlife. So I think psychologically as well, this is about getting into habits earlier on and building up a bit of strength earlier on, so that in later life it's kind of easier to continue exercising. But there are certainly benefits to starting exercise in later life as well. Yeah, and so basically I think generally you're pretty good for keeping your memory and thinking sharp. So we're not just talking about reducing risk for dementia, which exercise does, but actually in general there seems to be benefit of just generally keeping your mind sharp. Social contact. So this applies to social contact networks, both within and outside of your family. A lot of the report and a lot of the research actually talks about marital status and cohabiting. That's an easy piece of information to get hold of from various databases and things, and it's often used as a proxy for the amount of social contact people have. However, we know that that's not the whole story, and social contacts outside of immediate family or spouse are really important. It's not clear exactly how social contact reduces dementia risk. It's thought that it generally increases cognitive reserve, and cognitive reserve is this idea that your brain is able to better withstand damage or pathology. So it basically can use its resources better, and if its resources are limited in some way, for example by Alzheimer's disease, it's able to use those resources better, and the actual visible effects of the disease, the memory loss and the loss of ability to function, are just staved off a little longer. It also perhaps encourages other lifestyle changes like exercise. So if you've got a mate who you arrange to go take some exercise with, not only are you exercising, but you're getting your social contact as well. So you can see again how all these things are linked. I, for one, am much more likely to go exercising if I make an arrangement with a friend of mine. Let's go well, today, for example, I'm going swimming, but I tell my mate, let's go swimming, because if I don't, it's cold and it's wet and I'm unlikely to go if it's up to my own motivation. But we'll also have a chat and that sort of thing as well. Now, social isolation and withdrawal are very important. They're seen in the earliest stages of dementia. So they're often a symptom of dementia, as well as possibly being a risk factor for dementia. So we're not entirely sure yet about the extent of the cause and the consequence. So are people with lower social contact more likely to get dementia because of the low social contact, or is it the very earliest stages of dementia that are causing them to withdraw a little bit and isolate themselves a little bit? And that's called kind of causality, and that's something we need to do a lot more research on. And I've got to mention this. I made a deal with the BBC Radio Breakfast DJ, Gordon, this morning when I was on, and he said he'll plug this webinar if I give a mention to the BBC's Make a Difference initiative, which is for local radio day. If you go to that website, Monday, they're asking people to kind of make some contact with someone who you haven't had any contact with for a while, with the idea to kind of reduce loneliness and connect people up again. Okay, so this is the last risk factor I wanted to talk about, which I think is surprising to a lot of people, at least from people I talk to, that seems to be the case. So hearing. You can get hearing tests here, NHS website. Midlife hearing loss is associated with brain changes. So we can see in brain scans, there's changes that are important in the areas of the brain that are important for memory in midlife. Preventing hearing loss, as well as those direct changes to the brain, it probably helps us maintain social contact, which again is probably one of the ways that it contributes to reduced dementia risk. It probably also helps us maintain that cognitive reserve as well, if we can keep our hearing intact. The good news is use a hearing aid. It looks to be the case that if you wear a hearing aid, it removes the risk of dementia associated with losing your hearing. So it's a really easy thing to do to address that risk. If you have a hearing concern and you don't fancy going straight into the audiologist or whatever, you can actually do some hearing tests online. Specsaver's website can do it, and that will give you an idea of whether you need to go and get one in person and go and see the audiologist. And again, it's also probably wise to look out for relatives and friends who maybe have trouble with their hearing too. Now, I don't know if this was on your list of things that you thought might be on the risk factor list, but diet, you notice it wasn't on there, but of course it's linked to diabetes, cardiovascular health and obesity. Now, diet wasn't on the list of those 12 new risk factors because there's not enough specific evidence strong enough to support that it reduces dementia risk specifically. And that's what this report is all about. It's about the best scientific evidence. So if they're not sure of something, they're not going to put it on that list. However, the Mediterranean diet, the evidence I think is possibly getting there, and it might help. But the key here is that it certainly won't do any harm. And because it also will help reduce cardiovascular risk, thereby possibly reducing dementia risk, it is a diet that's recommended by the World Health Organization. And that's what that is, but there'll be lots and lots of information about that online. The evidence around dietary supplements is not strong enough to recommend them for reducing dementia risk at present. This includes vitamin supplements and things like ginkgo. We are at the University of Exeter doing research into this, particularly vitamin D. What we need is robust trials where people are randomized to treatment and we have kind of long-term outcomes. And there's just not the evidence there at the moment. The last thing I wanted to mention was that wasn't on the list that I thought people might be surprised about was cognitive training. So brain training, cognitive training is becoming increasingly popular. It's important to keep your brain active in later life, definitely. That's why we had social interaction on there. That's why hearing loss is on, hearing is on there. And indeed exercise. They're fun games and there's certainly no harm in playing them. But the evidence around them preventing cognitive decline or reducing dementia, specifically related to brain training, is at present a bit weak. And it's something we just need to do more research on. We're not saying it doesn't work, but we need to understand if it does before these things are recommended and before people spend their money on them and so on. And that's my last slide on risk factors. I'll just do a note on taking part in dementia research. Join Dementia Research is a national initiative. It's really good. It's a registry. You sign up and you'll get pinged emails when you might be suitable for a study. Our study at the University of Exeter is called the PROTECT study, and you sign up online and do some cognitive tests and questionnaires every year, and it's all done from home. And I'll just end, because I'm over time and I apologize about that, with a summary. So 40% may be preventable. It's a good news story. It's never too late, never too early. Exercise, cardiovascular health, social contact, hearing. These are all things we can do on our own to reduce our individual risk. It's probably good to take a holistic approach towards a generally a lifestyle that kind of incorporates as much of this as possible. And taking part in research is vital, as we do need to understand more about exactly how some of these risk factors contribute. What's the is there biological basis for them, and how much exercise do we recommend, and how much social contact, and whether cognitive training works, and whether vitamin supplement works, and so on. These are all questions for research that we need to get our teeth into, and we do rely on volunteers for that. So thank you very much for listening, and sorry for going slightly over, but I'll stick around for any questions, of course. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Byron, very much indeed for your talk. I'm just waiting for Mark to get back to pictures. Okay. Now, there have been lots of comments on the chat line as we've been going along. I want to just quickly respond to one, which came early on in your talk, Byron, but it wasn't actually addressed to you, it was more addressed to me, because I made the statement that dementia was the major cause of recordable death in the UK, and that's been challenged with some people who have commented that they thought it was sepsis. My defense is that what I've done is taken actually information from the Office of National Statistics and the information that they have on recorded deaths. So in other words, they're using what the doctor has written on the death certificate. Now, sadly, some of us know that when somebody dies, then there can be many things that are going on at the same time that maybe have contributed to the acute death, but the longer term may be something else like dementia, and that is what the doctor has chosen to write on the death certificate. So it's on the basis of the Office of National Statistics report from March early this year that I made that statement. But I'm sure that most of you feel that statistics can be interpreted in various ways, and that may need to be looked at again. So that's where that came from. Byron, I don't know whether you want to comment, but it came through, I noticed in the chat line, about exercise and looking after yourself. And I think it's Sally made the point that what is good for your heart is good for your brain. And this was one of the side findings from the Caerphilly study, which people may or may not know about, but this was a longitudinal study that started at the end of the 1970s, looking at the lifestyle factors of a group of middle-aged men, all from Caerphilly. And the main aim of it was to look for factors that could perhaps identify those who were more likely to have heart disease. And a spin-off from that research was the finding that those who exercised moderately but maintained a level of exercise, who looked after their diet, who didn't smoke, who only drank in moderation, whose life circumstances enabled them to avoid severe stress, not only was their heart conditions much healthier, but they were less likely to develop dementia. And so the Caffili study, in a sense by accident, but also showing the value of research with spin-offs, has led us to this general idea that what's good for your heart is good for your brain. Do you want to comment on that, Byron?
Yeah, sure. I think that's very true. I've heard it said a lot. I think a lot of what I was speaking about really, the exercise really, I think probably is all about cardiovascular health. And if you're, and that may be one of the major reasons why exercise is one of these big risk factors. I think there are, I think diet will play a role in that as well. And I suspect one thing to point out is probably the type of dementia as well. So in a lot of these studies, it tends to be what we call all-cause dementia, so Alzheimer's disease or vascular dementia or dementia with Lewy bodies. And there are some studies where it looks like some of those heart and cardiovascular health strategies have a bigger effect in preventing vascular dementia, and that's important. That's the second most common form of dementia. So that's a really important point. But and so it looks like damage or poor health in the vascular system is certainly really important. Yep, for Alzheimer's and maybe more so vascular dementia.
There were quite a lot of comments while you were giving your talk, and possibly surprise from some people about the the influence of hearing loss. And I know that you went on to talk about that and how it may be linked with the fact that it is recognized as being the most isolating of the out of the, what would be the right word to use, impacts of losing one of the special senses. So it's even more isolating than becoming blind. And part of this, I think, is maybe linked to when you become isolated, and this links with your point about the importance of social contact, is that when you become withdrawn, then you don't tend to look after yourself. And I think this is also true with the question which I've seen in the chat line about people who may have bouts of depression. And when you don't look after yourself, then you generally your health deteriorates. And so do you want to comment on that sort of general thought that that being depressed or with a severe hearing loss that isn't countered by hearing aids and by being an environment where people understand the issue and make an effort to keep you involved, how that isolating influence can have an effect?
Yeah. I think, again, we're seeing how all of these things are very closely related. And one thing that is really difficult to do is separate out the unique risk attributable to any one of these things. Absolutely, with hearing loss, it's not difficult to imagine how, if our main way of interacting with the world is interacting with other people, is speaking and hearing, and if we lose that, and if in particular, I suppose, if family and friends lose how to continue to interact with us, then you can see that you can see how isolating it would be. Now, whether it looks like hearing loss is one of the things we're a little bit more sure is a is a causal risk factor for dementia. So we know from studies that start very early on that, you know, midlife hearing loss is a risk factor for dementia, even when the dementia occurs many decades in the future. So it's unlikely that the dementia is causing the hearing loss. And we also see hearing loss associated with these brain changes. When it comes to then losing those social contacts, I would think then you're kind of having you're kind of having a double whammy, if you like, because we know that social isolation and loneliness, as you just said, well, loneliness in particular, actually, it's a little different to social isolation. Social isolation would be not seeing other people. Loneliness would be a feeling of not taking part in the world, feeling of being left out, and so on. Loneliness in particular is there's you could say a real epidemic of it in many Western societies. It is associated with worse physical and worse mental health, and we now know it looks like associated with a risk of dementia as well. So so to bring depression into it, it is quite difficult to separate out, I think, when depression occurs in the context of those two other factors, which is the driving force. Does the depression come first and then the withdrawal, or the withdrawal then the depression? Or, of course, withdrawal is a symptom of depression itself anyway. So I hope I'm not talking too much around in circles, but my general point is it's really difficult to separate out these three different things. Hearing loss, of course, we can try and do something about in some cases via hearing aids, and hopefully that would address the social contact. I just saw a comment come up about bereavement, and I might just mention that since we're talking about depression. And so I think it is important to find ways to maintain that social contact. And I'm conscious I'm talking in the middle of a pandemic when we're told not to do that. But I think actually that really underscores why we need to pay attention to this. When it comes to depression, looks like later onset depression that doesn't have another obvious explanation is sometimes the first symptom of the dementia. Whereas early life onset depression, we think is, well, it's going to be independent from dementia and possibly less of a risk factor for it. But certainly depression, hearing loss, social contact, even exercise, you can see how all those things are closely linked together. Which one to address? Which one is the kind of root cause, I think, is a tricky question. I think if hearing loss comes first, you could reasonably say that was the case, but individual circumstances will differ a lot, of course. So it's not an easy one to talk about how they interact. There's a lot we don't know still.
You're probably following the chat line as well yourself, Byron, but we've had a couple of questions about the impact of sleep or lack of it. Can that affect risk of developing dementia?
Yeah, so there's been some studies around sleep, and one or two of them have shown that either too much or too little sleep can increase risk of dementia. That probably tells us that there's still some more research we need to do in that area. One thing I would point out, and I'm thinking about one of the recent sleep headlines with respect to risk of dementia, is you'll often see in the news risk expressed as people who sleep too long have 50% more risk of getting dementia than people who sleep 7 hours a night. That's what's called relative risk. And it means that what it means is that the risk is being expressed relative to people who sleep normally. And to get the full picture, you need to understand what's called absolute risk. And so what I mean by that is your overall risk of getting dementia over if you're, say, in your 60s, late 60s, of getting dementia over a period of a few years is probably quite low, actually. However, what these studies will find is that, suppose, I actually don't know the figure, but suppose it's about 5% risk of getting dementia or something like that. And people who sleep 9 hours a night have a 6% risk of getting dementia. That's expressed as a 20% higher likelihood of getting dementia associated with sleeping longer, but the base risk remains pretty low. And I think that's generally pretty important to express, and I hope I've made that clear, but it applies to an awful lot of headlines about dementia. You'll see risk factors like sleep, and it will come up with this really scary figure of 20% higher risk of dementia or 30% higher risk of dementia, but it's relative to people who sleep normally, and your absolute risk probably remains pretty low.
There have been a couple of questions that, in a sense, link to what you said earlier in your talk about genetic influences. One query was about whether ethnicity it could be seen as a risk factor, and also whether a parent with dementia could be seen as a risk factor.
So parent with dementia would be a risk factor, likely because there might be things like you share an environment, so there might be factors like that link you that are not genetic, but you will share 50% of your genes with each parent. If one of them has dementia, that will increase your risk, but it probably won't increase your risk by a huge amount. And what we're seeing actually is that genetic risk is probably, overall, these lifestyle factors will be more important to worry about than a parent having dementia. You can do something about these, and they probably account for more of your risk than a parent with dementia. The other thing to say, by the way, is there is research going on to understand whether people who have a parent or two with dementia, if they undertake these lifestyle changes, can they remove that associated risk that's attributable to the genetics and to having a parent. So it's still really important to focus on lifestyle, even if you know from a commercial genetic test, or you think from your looking at your family history that you've got a genetic risk. It's really important to focus on lifestyle factors still. It's not I think it's important to try not to get into kind of fatalist kind of mindset, if possible, although I can completely appreciate the difficulties coming to terms with it. Race is quite a tricky one, and it is something as researchers we need to tackle, because we don't do enough research in Black, Asian and minority ethnic populations, and particularly around genetics. Most of the genetic research we can only talk about with respect to white populations, and that's a problem. And it's a problem around all of the West. The other complicating factor around understanding risk for dementia, according to ethnic background, is what we call confounding, and that means that many of the risk factors I spoke about, so air pollution and certain cardiovascular diseases and diabetes, they are more common, unfortunately, in Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups. And so it's sometimes difficult to separate out whether any increased risk of dementia is due to the race per se, or due to the health inequalities of people from these groups. Again, I think I would come back to the lifestyle factors, and no matter which what your ethnic background is to focus on those things: lifestyle, exercise, hearing.
I think that might be Annie Clayton with her comment on the chat line. We've been asked a question by somebody who's not been able to attend, and I think you've had prior warning of that question, Byron. It's about two medicines that are sometimes prescribed to prevent acid reflux, and a suggestion from an American study that these medicines might predispose people to dementia. Now, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at that, Byron. It's obviously a very specific question linked with a specific study. Mm-hmm. And so in Byron's defense, Byron will only be able to all of everybody who's joined the webinar, it's only fair if Byron's had a chance to go and look at that before putting him on the spot.
Yeah, I did have a quick check. My hunch beforehand was that it was probably an observational study, and it was. An observational study is one where we look at the data, existing data of people taking particular medications, and just look at their natural outcomes. And so you compare a group of people taking these Omeprazole, did we say, or Lansoprazole, or that class of medication, which I think is a proton pump inhibitor, we look at a group of people who have that prescription and a group of people who don't, and just look at their outcomes. And you can adjust statistically for certain confounding factors. So the group who are taking the drugs might be older, for example, and so you need to remove the effect of age on dementia risk. But observational studies, we can't remove all the confounding due to other factors. They're going to be in people taking the drugs are going to be in poorer health anyway. They may have a higher prevalence of obesity among them, for example. They may have a higher prevalence of diabetes, of high blood pressure. And so it may not be the medication per se, but it may be the comorbidities that go along with that. I believe the study adjusted as best it could for those, but it's not possible to do that completely. And I would say the general opinion, and I think it's better to give maybe a sort of general opinion than my own one, but the general kind of view would probably be that there's just not, that study can't prove that those medications cause dementia. The things that they are treating, stomach ulcers and so on, are probably much more important to get sorted than worrying about whether or not that's going to give you dementia. And I come back again to this idea of relative risk. So I think it was something like people taking proton pump inhibitors had a 40-odd% higher risk of dementia. But you've got to understand the overall risk of getting dementia during the period of follow-up of that study was probably pretty low. It's probably a few percent of people. And so you may be talking about, actually, although it sounds like a huge difference, that absolute risk is probably quite low. So there's two things. We can't tell that they cause dementia. On balance, it's probably better to keep taking them, and certainly discuss it with your doctor for the medical condition that they're prescribed for, and that relative absolute risk. So understanding that.
relevant to what you were just saying about the difference between a study that shows an association or a correlation between two factors, between that and then demonstrating cause and effect, links with a comment from Charles while we're thinking about numbers and statistics and assessing risk. He reminded me, and some of you will know this program, but there's a very good program on BBC Radio 4 called More or Less. And if you listen to more than a few episodes of that, you will become very skeptical about whatever you hear is being claimed by statistics and data. It just encourages us all to keep asking why questions, in a sense, or please clarify questions, and that's absolutely key. So thank you for that reminder, Charles, because that is a very good point. I'm going to throw out a slightly, hopefully not controversial idea. It's one that's been mooted by many people. We're puzzled by how so many things might be contributing to a brain disease. Air pollution, we've been talking about, dietary problems like diabetes type 1, type 2, and one of our contributors has referred to possibly a new brand of diabetes that's being investigated in New Zealand called type 3 diabetes. Also the impact of cardiovascular disease. We've been talking about a medicine for stomach ulcers, and then the susceptibility that may be coming with COVID-19. How can all of these be linked with a brain disease? And one of the factors that may be the link is that of chronic inflammation. The body likes to stay in a very steady state, and that whenever anything happens to perturb it, there are defense mechanisms that come into play. So if I was to get just a splinter of wood in my finger, everybody knows that when you have a splinter, you get an area of redness and inflammation around the splinter, and it deals with that locally. So the foreign agents that have been introduced with the wood splinter have been, if you like, neutralized, attacked, removed by the inflammatory process. Now that is just an isolated acute inflammation. But some of the illnesses we have, such as diabetes, problems with the stomach acid, the impact of air pollution on the lungs, these become long-term. And part of the inflammatory response is to release chemical signalers, signaling molecules that travel via the bloodstream. Normally, these wouldn't reach the brain, or they would reach the circulation of the brain, but they wouldn't reach the brain matter. There is a barrier between the blood vessels and the brain tissue that means that the brain's environment remains remarkably constant despite everything else that's going on in the body. If, however, something causes the integrity of that blood-brain barrier to break down, then there's the possibility of these inflammatory products from whatever is the underlying cause, heart disease, air pollution irritating the lung, a stomach problem, whatever. There's a risk of those mediators entering the brain tissue and triggering some of the responses, the abnormalities that we see in the brain cells, because their housekeeping does go wrong. So I'm just throwing that out and give you the chance to comment, Byron, because some of the people who've been joining us on the webinar but may be wondering, how can it be, as I say, that all of these varied things have been implicated? And it may be that the final common pathway is this inflammatory process and the brain trying to get over these inflammatory products. And in doing so, the housekeeping of the brain cells becomes deranged.
Yeah, we've got colleagues of mine in Exeter working on those very questions. So it's sort of this systemic inflammation. I probably don't have too much else to add. I've got to say I'm not a molecular biologist, but maybe just to give you a flavour of the kind of research going on, actually, my colleague, Professor Katie Lunnan in Exeter, is working with University of Southampton, who have a number of people have donated their brains to dementia research, and they were taking part in a clinical trial of a new dementia drug back in the early 2000s, and she's actually investigating whether systemic inflammation at the time of death is associated with any kind of increased risk of getting dementia. So these increased progression of dementia. Sorry. So these people, they had dementia at the time of taking part in the clinical trial, but very, very early stage, and they took the medication. So we have very detailed information on them. But I think those sorts of questions around inflammation, they really require very detailed and well characterized brain tissue, which is not always that common, but there are people that donate, and that is, yeah, we're researching that at the moment, or we are, my colleagues are.
Reassure everybody who's joined the webinar that you and I did not arrange for you to say that, but one of the important areas that Brace supports with funding is the Southwest Dementia Brain Bank, which of course is what you're referring to, which is where donors have volunteered to donate their brain when they've died, whether or not they've had dementia, because we need to understand normal brain structure and biochemistry, as well as what has gone wrong in somebody with one of the forms of dementia. So that's an area of Brace's work, which clearly you're benefiting from or your colleagues in Exeter, and one that we're very pleased to be able to support. I'm just going to take one last question, I think. And Helen has asked, would there be a benefit for the general public to have a better guidance on how to spot symptoms, signs and symptoms of dementia in other people, and then also ourselves? And she's linking that with PROTECT study. So I wondered if you would like to answer on that.
Yeah, I think we have a real job as researchers and working with charitable sector and any other people we can, really, to try and get these messages out there. So it's really, I really appreciate the question being asked, because it is very easy as a researcher to think that these things are just early signs of dementia, are things that everybody knows about, right? So thanks for asking it. I do wonder what, absolutely there would be benefit, although there's no cure for dementia. Getting assessed early and understanding whether it is dementia or whether it's something else is a positive thing to do. There are many cases where, so an early sign of dementia would be problems with memory, remembering maybe what happened last week, struggling maybe to plan a dinner with friends or cook dinner or something like that. But there are causes of that kind of impairment that are not dementia. And I think that it's a positive thing to sometimes to go to the memory clinic and to try and get that sorted out. And I think there should be better communication of what these early symptoms may be, both including dementia, but also things that aren't dementia. And and encouraging people to go and get a specialist assessment to get to the bottom of it. If those early signs will largely be things that you might notice would largely be memory, but there's also an increasing recognition of late onset changes in mood, so not long-standing things and not things that can be attributed to a bereavement, for example, that might get mood changes that might get better if they're over time, but new onset sustained changes in mood, but are looking perhaps to be important as well. But memory will be the main thing. It's kind of Stephen, you might have things to add to this, of course, but the kind of early stage memory change would be sort of remembering what happened a couple of weeks ago. If you go for a visit and you sort of say, "Mum, Dad, I came last week," they're like, "Oh yeah, of course you did." But you know, that happens to everyone, so it's not to be frightened about. But we're talking about things that tend to more heavily start to impact daily life as well. Again, I'm not a specialist in diagnosing dementia, so I and Stephen, you might know a little bit more or have something more to add to the early signs of dementia on that point.
I think the one that I would add, mainly from personal family experience, would be, I have to say that clinicians are much more expert than at making the diagnosis than those of us who are lay people. But often as a family member, as well as those memory things, whereas Byron says, we all forget some things from time to time, that's fine. But when it becomes a repeating occurrence, then we do tend to notice it in a relative. But the other one is making what I'll call irrational conclusions or making odd choices. And if we know our mother or father and we know quite a bit about what they're used to doing, suddenly if they start ordering things that they've never ordered before by mail order, it's something just to ask yourself about, because the rationality of decision making is something which does get changed in dementia. I will let Claire, I did say that we have that as the last question. I will let Claire's question sneak in if you're okay with that, Byron, which is,
of course, yeah,
because I think there is a thread in there. What evidence is there around movement, e.g. dance, to help with dementia, or other arts-based therapies?
I'll answer that in two ways, if that's all right, Claire, because you might be asking about two different things, so I'll cover them both. So dance, of course, is exercise. So if we're talking about, and it's social interaction in some ways, in some cases. So if we're talking about reducing risk for dementia, that would come under our exercise heading. Arts, I think that's about keeping your brain sharp. I would think it's about interacting. It's about keeping up a hobby and keeping active. So again, I think that there's probably no specific evidence that I'm aware of around that, but it's one of those things I think comes under the heading of there's certainly no harm in doing it, and it's probably quite good fun. So why carry on with it? And it's good to have hobbies. It will be good for a whole host of other aspects of your well-being, quality of life, and mental health, I would think. So you said for dementia in your question, which made me think you might also be asking about those particular interventions, or that's a horrible word, I think, like activities for people who have got dementia, who've got a diagnosis. We've carried out some research in people in care homes, and it looks to be the case that certainly activities that like simple things like dancing or engaging in arts, or even just talking to people, daily interaction really improves the well-being and quality of life, and in some cases symptoms of depression in people with a more advanced Alzheimer's disease who are in care homes. Now, of course, it's another thing that sadly it's not stopping the progression of the disease, but that's more about living well with dementia and trying to just improve quality of life in people who have the condition. So I think on both ends the short answer is I think yes, there's good evidence for that.
I think there's an aspect of dance, which of course involves music too, which reinforces routines. Dance music goes in a cycle, the dance steps go in cycles. And I wonder whether that helps us to maintain, that repetition helps us to maintain the integrity of some of the circuitry, remembering patterns. That's how the brain remembers things, by creating networks of nerve cells that communicate with each other. And the more that we can stimulate them and keep them running, then the better. And the same with making a picture. That, in a sense, is often a problem-solving exercise, which again draws on the neural circuitry, makes it work, finds an answer. So the more things that we do to engage with those sort of problem-solving type activities, doing jigsaws, something very, very simple, but it's a problem, which a visual and spatial problem, but it's using brain circuitry. And the more we can keep that brain circuitry stimulated, then the more benefit it will be. Well, I think we've overrun our time by quite a bit, but thank you very much, Byron, for joining us today and for your contribution to the discussion. And thank everybody for joining us today and for your questions and your comments that people will have been able to see in the chat line. I'm sure you've all appreciated how much more we need to do research, how we need to support researchers like Byron, how we need to support facilities like the brain bank that Byron referred to. And this is where we hope you might be able to help by helping Brace, perhaps with a donation. And you can find all of the details, how to go about that through our website. So it just leaves me to wish you all well for the rest of your day. I'm just looking out of my window and the weather's brightened here in Bristol. It was very miserable first thing this morning, but it has brightened up and it reminds me I need to go and do my bit of daily exercise. So goodbye and thank you for joining us, and we'll look forward to you joining us for another Brace webinar in the future. Bye-bye.
Bye. Pleasure to join. Bye.